Have you ever wondered why so little is known about the Nubian pharaohs that ruled all of Egypt around 700 BC? Is this merely coincidence? Was there a lack of accomplishment, importance, or significance surrounding their reign? Or is this absence of information contrived, premeditated, or purposeful? Is history being ignored or whitewashed? If so, why and by whom? Is there a religious connection? Is there a racial consideration? Or is it both? Where are we in the religious discourse pertaining to these rumors? Is it not significant that of the 4 pharaohs specifically mentioned by name in the Bible, Taharka, a pharaoh of this dynasty, is one of them? Furthermore, is it not also equally significant that Taharka is mentioned twice by name in the Old Testament and was interacting directly with the Hebrews, 2 Kings 19:9 and Isaiah 37:9? Is the inference of significance pertaining to this dynasty wishful thinking, or the desires of uninformed pundits? Absolutely not. Now let us roll back time and turn our attention to circa 700 BC. A historical and holy time, a time when the Bible was being written. As evidenced by the prophecies and teachings of Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah. It was a time when the great Nubian pharaohs of the Egyptian 25th dynasty protected their brethren, the Hebrew people, throughout their 100-plus year reign. A time of brother helping brother. For as the sons of Ham protected the sons of Shem, we find a historical paradigm of connection between the descendants of 2 brothers inextricably linked by God through his covenant with each son of Noah. The actions on the part of the Nubians were ordained by God.
Around the period of time the Old Testament was written, one has to understand that perhaps one of the most powerful countries in the world at that time was Egypt, or Kemet. Egypt during that time was ruled by a series of black pharaohs from Nubia. That was the 25th dynasty.
Why is this important? First and foremost, to adjust historical accuracy and to correctly link periods of human evolution. This missing chapter is critical in understanding man's anthropological, historical, religious, and social evolution. In our Western culture, the contributions of black people are tied directly to slavery in the Americas and its aftermath. Every other group's nationality and culture have well-documented archival information that provides clear and concise connections and links to their forefathers.
We have this painting of Nubians as somehow barbaric, somehow less civilized than Egypt. But in fact, what we know from the depictions of Nubian kings and the elite, the tombs, like the tombs that we're finding at Tombos, we know that Nubians led a sophisticated lifestyle, every bit as sophisticated as Egypt during the time of the Nubian dynasty.
So the 25th dynasty actually marked a major turning point in the history of the Nile Valley.
It's becoming more and more apparent that Egypt is Nilotic. It's the Nile River Valley, and the Nile River Valley not only flows from Nubia to Egypt into the Mediterranean, but the migration of population was northwards. So the point I'm making is that where does Egypt begin? In all likelihood, it begins in Nubia.
I'd like you to consider the following points of anthropological and scientific fact. The African continent is the birthplace of mankind. The human race is of African origin. Man's evolution was Nilotic, progressing from south to north. Since ancient Africa was a savanna, man's rudimentary foundation of civilization started here. Recent DNA research by the National Geographic have proved conclusively that man evolved from the Great Rift Valley and parts of Tanzania. It is without question that many of the early Egyptian rulers were black.
My wife and I took a trip to Egypt, and one of the highlights of our trip was to go to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And in the museum, they had artifacts from every dynasty in Egyptian history, with the exception of the 25th dynasty. In fact, they skipped the 25th dynasty and went directly to the 26th and 27th dynasty, the Greek dynasty, the Ptolemy dynasty. Now, I wonder, why was that such? Well, in the 25th dynasty, there's no dispute that that was a dynasty that was controlled, and the Pharaohs were all Nubians, black Africans. But yet and still, this dynasty was totally skipped and not acknowledged in the Egyptian Museum.
When you look at Egyptology and you go to any book on Egyptology, the first thing you will find omitting is Ham. And that's odd, because Egypt is called the land of Ham in antiquity. But you do not hear that mentioned in Egyptology. Why is that? Because if you mention that there was a Ham and this land of Egypt is called the land of Ham, then the Pharaohs are black.
There had been no acknowledgement over the several centuries that persons of color played a very important role, not only in their extensive interaction with the persons in the Hebrew Bible, and were themselves recipients and beneficiaries of God's promise to both Isaac and Ishmael, but also that these persons played a very important role in helping to save Jerusalem from the Assyrians during the time of the 25th dynasty, and these persons during New Testament times played a very important role in the very genesis and development of Christianity.
Because it is so difficult to find sufficient information for ancient history, I think historians pay a fair amount of attention to what's in the Bible. And because of that, it's not always so difficult to distinguish the more sort of theological presentation of what Yahweh did as opposed to actual historical events. And so the Bible is quite an amazing history book.
It's because the black pastors did not take enough time to study Scripture enough to find the line of Ham in the Bible. When you study the genealogical charts in the Bible from Ham, you can find exactly who was black. From the line of Ham to the line of Cush, Nimrod was the first king in human history, a black man. He's a king. The first queen mentioned in Scripture was the queen of the Ethiopians, the queen of Sheba, the queen of the south. She was a black woman. The first princess in Scripture was the princess that found Moses floating down the African river Nile. She was black.
So the Nubians play a very, very important role in biblical history during this time. As kings of Egypt, they formed an alliance with Hezekiah in Jerusalem, the king of Judah, who himself was fighting against the Assyrians and trying to ally with a number of smaller states that were located in the Levant against the threat of the Assyrians.
But it is also an aspect of really understanding that Egypt has been a very important part of the history of Israel. Every so often through the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, we have Joseph who ends up in captivity in Egypt and then becomes the second most important person after the Pharaoh in the Old Testament. And then we have also Joseph taking Mary and the newborn child Jesus, also running at the request of the angel of the Lord from Herod's anger into Egypt.
In this generation where the Bibles are being retranslated so that the common man can understand them for better versions, the well-known word of Ethiopian has been replaced and supplanted by the word Cushite. Now, if I asked you to explain to me what an Ethiopian looks like, you would say a black person. Now, if I asked the average person what does a Cushite look like, they have no idea. But this goes back to a lot of the things in Scripture are being hidden and subordinated because of the black heritage behind it. The Ethiopians were descendants of Cush. They were Cushites, but they were called Ethiopians.
What remains true is that the Bible is the oldest and most authentic book on black history in the world. There's no other book that validates the antiquity of blackness like the Bible.
A lot of great men in the Scripture were indeed married to black women.
David, Abraham, Moses, and Solomon. All four had one thing in common. They all four had Nubian wives.
There is no way that the religion of Abraham, David, Moses, and Solomon would allow them to marry a non-Hebrew. The importance of Nubian wives is a very strong indication of their religious proclivities.
It is well known that Abraham was mated with Hagar, and from this union came Ishmael. But also Abraham was married to Keturah, a woman of African descent. And it was her line that produced Jethro, whose daughter Zipporah was married to Moses. David, it is well known, was mated with Bathsheba, and Solomon was their son. These are just few of many examples that one can cite from black biblical history that showed the very close and intimate interaction between the Hebrew people and persons from Africa.
When I looked at Acts, the 13th chapter, I was surprised that the Bible says that when they were ordaining the Apostle Paul, that there were African bishops who laid hands on him and sent him into the world to open up the gospel into what we know as Europe.
One consequence for the rise of Western civilization, particularly the Atlantic Empire, the Atlantic World Empire of the major European powers, was the rise of the enslavement of not only Indians, but also persons from Africa. And as whites entered the role of scholars and major interpreters of the Christian tradition, there was obviously a vested interest, in a sense, to whitewash the role of blacks in biblical history, and also to sanitize Christianity so as to make it appear as a totally white religion, forgetting that many of the persons who were referred to explicitly and overtly in the Christian scriptures were persons of color.
understand that from the earliest dynastic periods, Nubia was always targeted and a matter of conquest for the Egyptian pharaohs because of its rich natural resources of gold and food from its fertile valleys. And as such, Nubia, or Nubians, often controlled Egypt. At times, it was very much a part of Egypt.
I see two major contributions of the Nubian dynasty of Egypt. The first is in reunifying Egypt against a threat from competing Libyan dynasts in the Nile Delta, and to face a larger threat from the Assyrian Empire. The second thing that I see that's important about the Nubian dynasty is that they created a new civilization based to some extent on Egypt, but intertwining and blending Egyptian elements with Nubian elements, forging a new culture that lasted for 1,000 years, which is a pretty good run for civilizations in terms of world history.
This particular dynasty was interesting because it did a number of things. One, it sort of rekindled, embraced the Egyptian lifestyle, the Egyptian religions, the Egyptians' attention to detail and monument building to the gods, and they sort of created a renaissance, if you will, of Egyptian culture. Even though they were adopting the culture and sort of doing a merging with their culture, it is known that they were actually more dominant in terms of embracing the Egyptian culture than most Egyptians.
Not only did Nubia, through a sort of cultural and technological transfer, absorb Egyptian civilization pretty thoroughly, it also made a huge contribution to Egyptian civilization by first politically getting some control over it, and then, say, energizing a major cultural revival that led into the great achievements of the next phase, the Saite period.
The Kushites were now going to reunify Egypt, like the pharaohs of old unified Egypt, and could restore the ancient kingship that was handed down by the gods, and that they were going to be the ones personifying this kingship.
And the Libyan anarchy was a scandal. That is, Pharaonic culture is not supposed to be split up into all these little things. It's supposed to be united. It's supposed to be strong. That's a religious duty. The Kushites may very well have been aware of the rising power of Assyria and its intentions to move westward. Now, how would they know about that is there were Kushites serving in the Assyrian military. Kushite horse trainers and charioteers. So once they retired, they could easily come home and bring the word to the Kushites that, you know, big trouble's on the horizon.
The Nubian dynasty that conquered Egypt in the late 8th century BC can be traced through a series of royal tombs at a place called El Kuru, which is near the fourth cataract of the Nile. And you see these tombs evolving. We don't know the names of the people who are buried there. Nothing has survived, but we can see that this tomb sequence, which probably began about maybe 900 BC, the earliest tombs are tumulus graves. They're round mound graves with pits underneath them where the body was buried. Tomb by tomb, they slowly evolve, or actually I should say they sort of rapidly evolve with Egyptian characteristics. There's a sequence of 14 tombs, and they seem to be husband and wife pairs. The earliest one of these rulers or chiefs that we know by name was a man named Alara.
Many historians believe that the reunification of the Nile Valley actually started with the Kushite leader, Alara. Though historical evidence is sketchy, he has been referred to by some as the Kushite pharaoh Alara, and the first pharaoh of the 25th dynasty. According to archaeologists, it is evident that Alara unified all of Upper Nubia from Meroe to the Third Cataract, thus initiating the unification process. It is believed that he is the one that established Napata as the religious capital of Nubia. Since Alara did not control any portion of Egypt during his reign, most scholars do not name him as either a Nubian king or pharaoh. However, artifacts and documentation refer to a lengthy reign, 30 years, and identify him as specifically revered in Nubian culture. We feel that it is safe to presume that Alara was most certainly a king or a pharaoh of Kush and founded the Napatan royal dynasty, which laid the foundation for the evolution of the 25th dynasty.
And it's he who is recorded in the inscriptions of his descendants to have been the first one to dedicate himself to Amun and dedicate his sisters to Amun. In other words, these women become potential wives of the god because according to the royal myth, that each new king is fathered by the god rather than a real king.
Well, very little is known of Alara because he was really known to us from later inscriptions that refer to him as the early father of the dynasty.
When one looks at Nubian chronology, there is still some controversy, and one reason for the controversy is that there is growing evidence that Alara was, in fact, the first pharaoh of the 25th dynasty. But scholars are still needing to find more archaeological evidence to back it up. But what scholars are on solid ground in regards to is the reign of Kashta.
Third Intermediate Period Ancient Egypt, a time of anarchy, a time of disarray, a time of acute turmoil. Some historians believe that the actual reunification of Egypt began with the Kushite king Alara, brother of Kashta, and that upon his death, Kashta assumed control. He extended the Kushite Empire to Aswan, the southern border of Egypt. Archaeologists found a small broken monument near Aswan, there containing his portrait. An inscription on the stone quotes him boldly calling himself King of Upper and Lower Egypt, which was the title of an Egyptian pharaoh. Although historians do not credit Kashta with the title pharaoh, he met the ruling criteria to be so named.
Kashta, his name, there's been some argument recently about it meaning, but it probably does mean the Kushite, but not as an Egyptian word, even though it's written in Egyptian. He's the first of the line to appear in Upper Egypt in his own inscription.
Kashta seems to have led the expansion of Nubia into Egypt. And he did it in a way that seems to have been more diplomatic than military. Although you can be sure it was backed up by military force, he seems to have forged a close alliance with Thebes and the administration of Thebes at that time, which had forged a kind of independent political status from the competing dynasties that ruled in the Nile Delta. And we suspect, although we don't know explicitly, but we suspect that the Thebans were already worried about the Assyrian threat coming from the north and saw the emergence of Nubia as a power and potential ally to reunify Egypt to meet that threat from the north, but also simply to take these rival dynasties bickering amongst themselves, unify them, and create in Thebes also an important power center.
Though the exact timeline is a bit sketchy, historians concur that his major adversary was Osorkon IV, a leader, king, and sometimes mentioned member of Dynasty 22, believed to be of Libyan descent.
I think the Libyans saw this as, being opportunistic adversaries, saw this as a chance, or maybe we can take advantage of some semblance of a transition or succession here. And this was dealt with by Kashta and his army. precisely and decisively. So any insurgent activity that was being promoted by the Libyans was apparently quickly quelled.
Also, Nubian soldiers have had a reputation for millennia for being very sophisticated archers, and in fact being very courageous soldiers, even outside of this Nubian Egyptian corridor, within other areas in Turkey as well, the Persian Gulf as well. Kashta was also a very savvy politician, and so his daughter, the Kushite princess Amenirtis I, was appointed as God's wife of Amun and the divine adoratress of Amun.
One of the most interesting figures of the 25th dynasty is Amenirtis, who held the title of divine adoratress of Amun at Karnak. This is another interesting feature of the dynasty, is that they raised this particular office, which had been gaining in power earlier as well under the Libyan pharaohs too, but they really raised it to an important level, political level and economic level in society. And it's an important and critical role for a woman to hold. And this is something that is a common feature, especially in later Nubian culture, but also from what we know about the 25th dynasty, is that women held a much more prominent role in politics and influence than they did in Egypt, and are represented much more as equals. And it's interesting to note that Amenirtis' tomb and the tomb of the other adoratresses is rivals in size the tombs of contemporary pharaohs at that time, and attests to the political power of that office.
The divine adoratress of Amun is the daughter of the pharaoh, or the successor pharaoh. And so, in truth, what seems like a purely religious role is actually a way of politically signaling who is going to be the successor.
The God's wife of Amun did not inherit the office. She adopted her successor. They did not have children. Presumably they were celibate, in other words. And they lived a long time as a result of a lack of exposure to the dangers of life, particularly childbirth.
The power of the high priestess is not a role that we would be familiar with within our contemporary society. But think of the role of the Pope, for instance, in terms of the enormity of that individual's power. The particular cult of Amun was extraordinarily wealthy because it had control of large expanses of lands and farms and the taxes from them and so forth. As a consequence, it was the high priestess who made determinations in terms of, are we going to invest in irrigation projects? Are we going to build new temples? So forth and so on. What are we going to do about unemployment? I mean, there were very practical economic issues even at that time. And the high priestess was right in the middle of it.
To further the political connection with the Egyptian religion, the pharaoh presents himself the equivalent to a pope. Scholars believe that the word icon is a better translation of a description of God's messenger on earth. This literal interpretation would indicate that because this person is the head of the religion, that unequivocally makes him or her royal.
We don't know, we don't have physical details of what she did. In other words, we don't have instructions or edicts or legal documents that she signed or things like that. But she occupied the position where she was the chief person.
Amenirtis held the position of God's wife of Amun through the reign of Taharqa. It is important to note that historians believe she was the chief advisor to the pharaohs on all matters, and some equate her position to that of a co-pharaoh.
The key thing about Kashta, he's also the father of both Pianki and Shabaka, who were the next succeeding pharaohs.
Pia, he inherited his position in Upper Egypt from his father. And he was not really intending, apparently, because he did not undertake any action there until his reign was well advanced.
Historians believe it was either from 752 to 721 BC or 747 to 716 BC that Payanke officially founded the 25th dynasty. Payanke consolidated Upper, Middle, and Lower Egypt by way of victory at Heracleopolis after a 5-month siege. His victory included the vital cities of Hermopolis and Memphis. While he ruled and resided in Napata, the capital of Nubia, Payanke allowed the local kings in Lower Egypt to rule at will.
Payanke is best known as being a brilliant military strategist. His father, Kashta, was able to make many political and diplomatic arrangements, but it was the son who was able to conquer the entire society, civilization of Egypt. First, he conquered Upper Egypt, which is the portion of Egypt closest to Nubia. And his armies kept moving further and further north until he had finally encompassed Lower Egypt as well.
It was a pharaoh, a black pharaoh in the 25th dynasty, that finally united the northern and southern areas of Egypt and brought a spirit of unity and tore down racial walls. And Egypt became the most powerful nation at the time because of these walls being torn down.
He adopted many of the Egyptian mores and customs, and he became a very, very proud Egyptian pharaoh.
Where Thutmose III identifies himself as, the strong bull born and arising in Thebes, Payanke, who uses Thutmose's throne name, also calls himself the strong bull arising in Napata.
An individual, a Libyan, one of the parts of the Libyan anarchy, started to unite the various forces and kingdoms in the north of Egypt into a single unit and to prepare for an attack on Pia in the south. Pia marshaled all his forces and in a single year completely defeated the forces of the north. They did not attempt to impose a unitary kind of rule on Egypt at that time, but he certainly established complete ascendancy over Egypt. His inscription that records it is one of the finest pieces of historical writing in ancient Egyptian.
He says, gods make a king, men make a king, but Amen made me. So in other words, my kingship is superior to everyone else's in that I'm going to be the emperor. And he took his forces to the Delta.
And then finally, when he ended up in the Nile Delta, one of my favorite things, in fact, one of the most clever things that I think any Nubian pharaoh did, was when he held court and he took the obeisance of these Libyan dynasts and other petty rulers in the Nile Delta. He sent most of them away because they'd eaten fish. And as any good Egyptian should know, of course, you can't approach a god, a pharaoh, after having eaten fish because you were ritually impure. So he was telling them how to be Egyptian and favoring the one particular individual who was adhering to those rules and sending the rest away. And that, to me, is just an amazingly clever and sophisticated way of establishing control over the country.
Pia is the first one to realize that he could move forward and actually subdue all of these little kingdoms in the Delta and Middle Egypt. And really, he set the tone and showed that no, we can actually have a policy that goes all the way to the sea and maybe beyond into Palestine if we need to.
Soon, Pae was given a reason to intervene further north. Tefnakte, a Libyan, the prince of western Egypt, ruler of the delta city of Suez, extended his control south by capturing the city of Memphis and the old middle kingdom of Ichtawe, Lisht. At first, Pae merely checked Tefnakte's movement while moving southward with a pair of naval victories in Middle Egypt. Here, he left the Sate rulers in control. However, after spending New Year's in Nubia, Paye returned to Thebes, joining his sister, Amenertis I, in time for the Great Opet Festival, and subsequently set about planning to place the remainder of Egypt under his control. His troops moved north, capturing 3 towns, and killing one of Tefnakte's sons in the process. After conquering Egypt, Paye went home to Nubia, and according to historians, never again returned to Upper Egypt. This was presumed he didn't need to return due to his strength as a ruler and the lack of conflict under his authority. He is portrayed as a ruler who did not glory in the senseless killing or torture of his adversaries, as did other kings, but rather preferred treaties and alliances. He left the rule of his country largely in the hands of his vassals. During Paye's reign, the entire kingdom enjoyed a resurgence of Egyptian culture, religion, and sophistication. Apparently, when Paye returned south to rule from Nubia, Tefnakte reasserted his power. His successor was his son, King Bekenrenef, also called Pacorus, who reigned from the royal palace in Sais. The Pharaoh Shabago dynasty ended Bekenrenef's reign and attempts to assert Libyan power over Egypt in 715. Bekenrenef was reportedly buried alive. Around 716 BC, Shabaka succeeded his brother, Paye, as king. The Kushites created a new tradition of regal succession, not from king to king's son, but from king to brother to king's son. Shabaka recognized the mistakes his brother made in ruling from the south and set forth on a course to reconquer all of Egypt and to rule from the north. Shabaka was crowned pharaoh of both Egypt and Kush upon the death of his brother Paenki. It is presumed that he was crowned in Napata and that the Egyptian princess of northern Egypt revolted. Let's assume to take advantage of the transition of power. Shabaka reinvaded Egypt, denoted Memphis as the capital, ruled from there, and established diplomatic relations with the Assyrians in Nineveh. Some historians reference that Shabaka ruled from Thebes, and others believe there existed dual capitals. With the ascension of Shabaka, Egyptian and Nubian history became one.
Shabaka, his name in itself means beautiful is the soul of Ra. He was a powerful leader, but he was also a very cultural leader.
During Shabaka's reign in the 25th dynasty, there was much building, there was much construction that went on. In fact, during this period, the Nubians built pyramids. Paye, upon his death, was actually buried in one of these Egyptian model pyramids.
Shabaka was known as the builder of the 25th dynasty, particularly in the city of Thebes. In Karnak, there still stands the pink granite statue of Shabaka wearing the twin crowns of Egypt. He was also credited for the restoration of the gate at Karnak. Shabaka also championed the return to the many ancient religious customs of ancient Egypt, particularly pyramid burials, as further evidence of his embellishing Egyptian customs and mores. The most distinguishing literary documentation of his reign is the Shabaka stone. The stone is a slab of nearly black-green breccia, stone measuring approximately 66 centimeters in height and about 137 centimeters in width. It was incised with the remaining hieroglyphs of a decaying papyrus that was also worm-ridden.
He spent a great deal of time in codifying some of the writings that had never been codified or that had been lost, such as what we call the Shabaka stone or the Memphite theology. This Memphite theology is of profound importance because it is the only written presentation of the fundamental theology that governed large parts of ancient Egypt. It appears that Ptah, especially as he was articulated by Shabaka, was one God. That here we're talking about a monotheistic system. And what is becoming more and more apparent is that the attributes of Ptah are in fact the attributes of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Unlike Payanke, Shabaka did not record his many achievements. Therefore, his activities have largely been recorded through the eyes of others. Question: is Shabaka the soul mentioned in the Old Testaments, ruled from Thebes? Do we need to mention his attempt to thwart the Assyrian belligerents by getting Palestine and Syria to revolt?
The Assyrian challenge began during the later years of his reign.
Now, Syria was the strongest power at that time in the 8th century BC, and they were very predatory. The Assyrians had heavy chariotry, heavy cavalry, and they also had heavy armor, bronze, scaled armor, corselets. You see the Assyrian reliefs, the armor is drawn with great detail.
Yeah, Shabaka was the main person who faced off initially against the Assyrians. And through a combination of military power and negotiations, he managed to keep the Assyrians at bay.
Mainly because he ruled from the Egyptian capital rather than the Nubian capital. Interestingly enough, this standard doesn't apply to any of the other dynasties.
He faced a big revolt in Upper Egypt. The Libyan dynasts revolted again. They stayed in power for enough time for this one ruler to be called the 24th dynasty. But Shabaka did quash the revolt and executed the rebel.
Shabaka eliminated the insurrections in Lower Egypt by defeating the Libyan Bechen-Renouf around 715 BC. To set an example, Shabaka burned him alive to avert any further rival uprisings. Joshua's scripture about burning. Unlike his older brother Pae, Shabaka believed in more of a direct, hands-on rulership. With the assistance of his sister, Amanirdis, Shabaka ruled sternly but fairly. Complementing his style of governance, Shabaka was known as the Builder, and is noted for massive construction projects directed toward rejuvenating Egyptian culture and religion. The overall control that was exerted by Shabaka in the southern portion of the 24th dynasty territory in the northern delta is indicated by the vast array of documented building that he undertook during his reign. Specifically on the West Bank, he enlarged the 18th dynasty temple at Medinet Habu. On the East Bank, he did renovations at Luxor and at Karnak. He built a structure called the Treasury of Shabaka between the Achmenu and the northern enclosure wall of the Aiput Aisut. He's also credited with enlarging the entrance to the Temple of Ptah. The fourth pylon at Karnak has an inscription that recorded his restoration of the gate. And many historians believe it was probably Shabaka who directed the building work near the future kiosk of Taharka in Mantu beside the sacred lake. After eliminating the threat from Assyria, Shabaka reigned in peace and is renowned for being the most prolific builder of the 25th dynasty.
It was Shabitku, apparently, who actually had to fight the Assyrians in their first round of battles. And that was long about 701 BC.
there had clearly been an alliance between Hezekiah, Jerusalem, and Shebitko. The king of Jerusalem had cast his lot in with the Egyptians, had put his safety in their hands. And I think the Assyrian messenger arrived at the walls of Jerusalem and said, "Why are you putting your faith in the Egyptians? They're like a broken reed that will, if you rest on a broken reed, it will pierce your hand." At the moment when the Assyrians were besieging and taking Lachish, another town in the kingdom of Judea, the Egyptian army arrived and caught the Assyrians. It wasn't a unified force, they were disconnected. And somehow it was enough to frighten the Assyrians off. And they made some kind of an alliance or a treaty not to attack again. It was kind of a stalemate.
The Assyrians were turned back. And even as the Assyrians tried to press into Egypt, they were turned back as well, and put some limits, put some circumscriptions on how far the Assyrian Empire could extend with regard to territory that was claimed both by the Hebrew people and by the Egyptians.
As is stated in many ancient texts, the Hebrews revered their cultural, economic, and political relationship with the Nubians and viewed them as follows. Ethiopia and Egypt were their strength, and it was infinite. During a period of almost 100 years, the pharaohs of Egypt confronted and defeated primarily the forces of Libya and Assyria as means of providing political stability, peace, economic growth, and cultural rejuvenation throughout the region.
One thing we have to say about the 25th dynasty in general here is there was an intense level of reverence and respect for Egyptian culture, Egyptian social mores, Egyptian lifestyle. So part of their dynasty or their reign showed if you want to call it a renaissance of Egyptian culture. At the death of Shebitku, know that Taharka becomes Pharaoh.
It was during his reign that Egypt's nemesis, Assyria, at last invaded Egypt. The Assyrian king, Esarhaddon, led several campaigns against Taharka, which he recorded on several monuments. Although many historians point out that many of the victories claimed by the Assyrians were exaggerated, and many were actually Egyptian victories.
He ruled all of Egypt and northern Sudan. He ruled the areas of the deserts, the oases settlements, and his sphere of influence extended well into what we call the Holy Land and up the coast of Lebanon. I mean, all of those city-states were vassals to him, and they looked to him for protection.
Taharka had an exceptionally long reign. He lasted quite a while, and both in Egypt and in Sudan, he was considered a great builder.
So Taharka is one of the greatest leaders of the Nubian dynasty, but a kind of tragic figure as well. On the one hand, he was one of the greatest builders in Nubian history. He renovated temples up and down both Nubia and also in Egypt. He left monuments at Karnak, for example. He also fought against the Assyrians, and here's where he had mixed success.
Unfortunately, at that time, the Assyrians decided to come west again, and they took the side of the Libyan dynasts in the Delta, and they attacked Taharka, but the first attempt was driven off.
Esarhaddon's first attack in 677 BC was aimed at pacifying his allies in the Arab tribes around the Dead Sea. This conflict led him as far as the Brook of Egypt. It is generally assumed that Esarhaddon then proceeded to invade Egypt proper in Taharka's 17th regnal year after he had settled a revolt at Ashkelon. History records that Taharka defeated the Assyrians on that occasion.
The Pharaoh Taharka had a reputation in many domains because he was also a great military leader. He was apparently a great politician, and he was quite a diplomat. And we see that in terms of Taharka having been called by the Hebrews to help them in their fight against the Syrian invasion of Jerusalem.
Well, the Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, my understanding is that they were really an important force because the Pharaoh was also the king of Ethiopia at that time. And, that was a lot of military power. And so Israel, the northern kingdom, was already afflicted. Samaria was already conquered by the Syrians. A lot of other cities, which you hear in the chapter, into the text, have been already destroyed and annihilated. And here where the challenge for Hezekiah comes, because the Syrians are saying, don't run to the Pharaoh, it's not going to help you. And if he is going to try to help you, will come back as something that you're going to regret anyway. And they're actually trying first to buy the people of Jerusalem to actually submit to the Syrians so they can join forces and continue the conquest further south towards Pharaoh. And so Israel was really now starting to become themselves a more mature state. This is why Assyria really wanted to actually look upon the opportunity to conquer Jerusalem. If they couldn't actually befriend them, then they can focus further on the south, which will, of course will be the Pharaoh. And this is where it actually puts Israel and Judah, both kingdoms, into the situation of really looking who are their friends and who are their foes. We need to look upon the way that Jerusalem was placed. And so for people coming to trade from the north, they will have to pass through Jerusalem to make it towards Egypt. And so it was a very important route. Whoever controlled that route will have had tremendous benefits.
There was a threat that if King Hezekiah did not succumb to Sennacherib, then his army would come and demolish his whole territory.
When the Nubian armies marched north into Israel-Palestine, they were marching as allies of Hezekiah, attempting to lift the siege of Jerusalem. And I agree, along with some other scholars who suggested that in fact the Nubians played a key role in lifting that siege.
And in Isaiah chapter 37, 8 through 9, the rumor was the mighty warrior that united the nations was coming. His name was Taharka of Ethiopia, the southern Pharaoh, was coming to attack Assyria.
They met the Assyrians at El-Teka. And the Assyrians, of course, always claim a great victory. Whatever else happened, it would appear that the Cushites did not cease campaigning, the Assyrians did not cease campaigning, but then Assyria left without taking Jerusalem. And apparently the Cushite intervention for the time being succeeded in deflecting the Assyrians.
The Bible says that an angel of God smited the 180,000 Assyrians. And the next day, when Hezekiah arose from his slumber and looked over the walls and saw the 180,000, he was astounded.
So immediately the Syrian general pulls up all his troops and returns back.
That's right.
I think it's no coincidence that Sennacherib, after the campaign, the Nubian campaign in the Battle of El-Tek, when he pulls out of the southern Levant, he pulls out for 20 years. And I think that's because he realized that he was overextended, that the combined Nubian and Egyptian armies represented a real threat to Assyrian expansion, and that he had to regroup, consolidate before he could attempt to conquer that part of the world and move on to conquer Northeast Africa.
And I think that we would say that your question about the angel, the protection of the angel, that would not be realistically or really an angel. That is a metaphor for God's intervention, however, and we believe that this was in the form, as in Chronicles with the pestilence, this is a form of a plague.
I contend that without the participation of the Nubians, we probably would not have had the survival of Judaism as we know today, and thus perhaps not even the advent of Christianity.
I think an area that really has not been sufficiently looked into by scholars is just the connection between Taharka, the Cushites, and the Hebrews, what in fact was the interaction that would allow for the Hebrews to call on Taharka, and for which it would be of sufficient historical importance that it would even be mentioned in the Bible.
It is believed that 3 years later, in 671 BC, the Assyrian king captured and sacked Memphis, where he captured numerous members of Taharka's royal family. Taharka fled to the south to Thebes, and Esarhaddon immediately reorganized the political structure in the north and established Necho I, the eventual ruler of the 26th dynasty, as king at Sais. Taharka, intrigued by the affairs of Lower Egypt, supposedly and he eventually reclaimed what he lost and reestablished himself as pharaoh in Memphis, fanned numerous revolts. Esarhaddon died before he could return to Egypt, so it was left to his heir and son Assurbanipal to once again invade and control Egypt.
3 years later, they came back, and then Taharka was defeated, and some of his family were taken off to Assyria. And Taharka really had to go back to Cush.
During one of those defeats, Amenadiris dies. That's the pillar of stability. She's been the co-pharaoh, remember, since her brother, Pi, or Pianki. There was probably some void or vacuum of stability and leadership at her death.
Assurbanipal defeated Taharka, who afterwards fled first to Thebes, then up the Nile into his native homeland, Nubia. Taharka died there in 664 BC and was succeeded by his appointed successor, Tantamani, a son of Shibaka.
People sometimes say that because Taharka was eventually defeated by the Assyrians, that therefore he was somehow unsuccessful, or the Nubians couldn't stand up to the Assyrians. But it's easy to forget that the Assyrians pretty much had their way in the Middle East during this period. They defeated every army they went up against, and usually quite easily. So the fact that Taharka, during his long reign, managed to keep them at bay for most of it, and even push them back on several occasions, is quite an achievement and accomplishment.
As the builder, he consolidated this pharaonic culture from basically Meroe in Sudan all the way to the sea, whereas as a single kind of cultural unit.
It is believed that Queen Qualhata, depicted on the dream stela, is the mother of Tantamani, who became the last pharaoh of the 25th dynasty.
Tantamani, a successor of Taharka, came to the throne and also moved into Egypt and to get control over the Nile Delta.
Tantamani was the nephew of Taharka. His succession to throne is documented in a dream stela that was found with Paye's victory stela at Gebel Barkal in 1862, currently is housed in the Nubian Museum in Aswan. He is buried in the necropolis at Nuri in Tomb 16. Tanwetamani was the last ruler of the 25th dynasty. In the narrative of his stela, the king is referred to as Lord of Valor like Montu, great of strength like a fierce-eyed lion. It goes on to explain that in the first year of his reign, Tanwetamani had a dream of 2 serpents, one on his right hand and one on his left. After waking, the king's advisors interpreted the dream, saying that the southland is already thin, seize the northland. His interpretation was that he should bring Egypt back under the control of the Kushite Empire. Historians also assume that at the time of his accession, Tanwetamani was inside Egypt proper. The text on the stela states, "He went from where he was to Napata, Nubia, and there was none who stood up to oppose him." This indicates that he went to the temple of Amun and was acknowledged as god and king. Other texts within the stela confirms that he was at this time in control of southern or upper Egypt, but at the very least was not in control of parts of the north. After ascending the throne, he went north from Nubia, first stopping at Elephantine, where he participated in a festival procession of the god Khnum. From there he sailed further north to Waset, Thebes, where he once again participated in the festival. Nikau of Sais may have been killed in this battle, but his son, Psamtik, who was loyal to the Assyrians, fled to Asia. After this victory, Tanwetamani honored the god Ta-Sakor and his wife Shachmet in the great temple of Memphis, and afterwards ordered the building of a chapel dedicated to Amun at Napata in Nubia. Tanwetamani apparently spared the lives of the Delta princes, sending them home, but this victory was very short-lived.
The Assyrian army marched back into Egypt, and this time they had reinforcements. They not only reconquered Lower Egypt, which is the northern part of Egypt, but they kept moving, and they conquered Upper Egypt. And in conquering Upper Egypt, by then they are pushing out the dynasty of the 25th dynasty.
So he was the last king to attempt to take back Egypt from the Assyrians. And for a brief time he was successful. And this shows the robust relationship between these Nubian kings and the people of Nubia at that time and Thebes. Because the Thebans could have taken the easy way out and resisted Tanwetamani and stayed with their Assyrian allies. But in fact, they felt so strongly against the Assyrians and for the Nubians that they welcomed Tanwetamani back in, supported his campaign against Assyria, and paid the price, because after the successful Assyrian campaign defeating Tanwetamani, Thebes was sacked for the first time. And this was, of course, a tragic moment in Egyptian history, also in Nubian history.
And that is mentioned in the Bible, the sack of No Ammon, as they referred to Thebes. It really shocked the ancient world because it was such a great capital.
Tanwetamani seems to have continued to be acknowledged as pharaoh in Thebes until his 8th year. There are inscriptions that were discovered at the Luxor that date the installation of priests by his name, which would indicate the Kushites still maintained a large official presence in the city. Paye's daughter, Shepenwepet II, succeeded Amenirdas I as God's wife of Amun, with Taharka's daughter, Amenirdas II, as her designated successor. From the beginning of Tanwetamani's reign, his cousin remained the high priest of Amun, and there exists other evidence of Kushites' continued power within the region. The Assyrian reconquest effectively ended Nubian control over Egypt, although Tanwetamani's authority was still recognized in Upper Egypt until his 8th year, around 656 BC, when Psamtik I's navy peacefully took control of Thebes and effectively unified all of Egypt. Thereafter, Tanwetamani ruled only Nubia. He died in 653 BC and was succeeded by Atlanersa, a son of Taharka.
Essentially what happens is that the Assyrians are able to push the Nubians back into Nubia, and they establish themselves as the next dynasty of Egypt. Of course, Nubia certainly does not die at that moment. There is this interesting transformation that occurs. The capital, over the course of the next several hundred years, is moved from Napata to Merowe. Napata at the 4th cataract, Merowe further south at the 6th cataract. And we have this resurgence of Nubian civilization.
But it's important to remember that the civilization and the dynasty that they had founded lasted and continued to be powerful in the south for another 1,000 years.
The end of this very important dynasty, this very important era in Egyptian history, is uncertain and largely unknown. But we do know that it was a golden age for Egypt because much building was done under the kings, particularly the 3rd king. There was much renovation to Memphis and to Napata and to Thebes and other cities in Egypt. And there was a great golden age of architectural achievement as well as cultural achievement during this important 25th dynasty of Egypt.
It is a turning point for both Egypt and Kush. Kush, before the 25th dynasty, it clearly had gotten itself organized, as Kadimala's inscription shows. But it had not congealed into a Northeast African power or a monumental state. The 25th dynasty caused it to actually consolidate itself as a fully organized state of imperial size. So, and it lasted until about 370 or so AD. So this continued as a imperial sized state for 1,000 years, which is a very, very long time.
This is a period that has been grossly overlooked, has not been a part of history, because as we all know, history is usually defined and written by conquering groups.
In school, Africa either was never in the textbooks or otherwise it was at the very end and we never got to it. And when I started college, I was really excited about the possibility of really getting into African history, but the problem was I was delighted to be at Harvard, but there was no study of Africa. There was no study of African American history.
I think that this particular story begins to tell that whole concept of who we came from, why we were important, and what contributions were made to civilization.
Well, one of the things about the Nubian dynasty is that it's tended to be overshadowed by Egypt. And that's the case for Nubian history in general. Nubia was first excavated and kind of investigated by Egyptologists. And sadly, because of both colonial attitudes and racist attitudes of the time, they tended to look at Nubia as in the periphery, in the shadow of Egypt, and that attributed any good things that happened in Nubia, any sophisticated things that happened in Nubia, to Egyptians. And that suited their ideas about sort of superior groups of people. At one point, they even tried to say that the Egyptians were from northern parts and not even African at all.
For centuries, literally, European scholars, using no evidence whatsoever, were insisting that the Egyptians had migrated from the Mediterranean.
If you look today at the Cairo Museum, the face of the Cairo Museum, you'll see these great marble plaques that are on the walls, and every single dynasty is mentioned, except the 25th dynasty.
You see, well, political science teaches us in college that no one records the successes of the enemies. So they have to structure the absence of the truth to teach the lie. The only way you can teach the lie is to remove the truth.
I personally believe that through history there was no justice. What I've understood is that the Europeans in their voyages and their archaeological research, and also with Germany, especially with Nazi Germany exploring Egypt, for going to going into the tombs or going looking for mystical powers in their research then at that time. What I found is that historically they destroyed many of the figure faces of the statues of the images. When they seen an African type of feature of a pharaoh or a queen or officers or warlords of that time, they seemed like they got upset and they downplayed that they were black in origin and they were part of the family of Cush of Noah.
Colonization, slavery, manipulation of wars, manipulation of resources, propaganda, misinformation, misinterpretations of Bible passages, systematic theological deceptions, all kinds of things that have happened over the years for the people to be afraid to be critical in their thinking, to be afraid to even hear God. Because for so long, this is what they've told me this has meant, that I feel like I'm a straight sinner if I even question what my pastor said or what my rabbi said.
I believe that this is the time, and this is the season, that the understanding of history, of more truthful, being that through the internet and through, you can Google things and go right on top of pyramids nowadays and go right to streets and research things, that we're realizing that someone tried to wipe history.
And certainly the one civilization that received a stronger legacy from Egypt was not the Middle East, but Nubian civilization in Africa. And it just highlights the fact that Egypt is an African civilization. Its people are an African people that were related to Nubians, that interacted with Nubians, whose civilization went side by side and developed with Nubia, with each contributing to the other.
And you understand now that in Cush, while people imitated Egyptian things in Greece sometimes and in Rome sometimes, they even had a cult of Isis at Pompeii, for example, they never did it coherently. The only place where pharaonic culture was practiced coherently, idiomatically, if you want to call it that, as though it were Egypt itself was Cush.
We hope that this is just the beginning of a trend of reevaluating what we know and what we're going to emphasize in our holy texts. I owe to my children, my grandchildren, and to the society that I come from, that this information be given a fresh look at.
To me, this is such a rich area for serious research because part of the story is not being told. And I think it's the work of historians and others to try to go back and fill it in so that we have an honest story of what actually happened.
And not knowing this history, to me, is actually a form of malnourishment that all people have. All of us are suffering from a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge as to who we are and how we developed and evolved. So I feel that for young people, this is a great time and it's a great opportunity to not just understand these things in the context of civilization, but also to understand them from a more holistic standpoint, where that spiritual side is being nourished also. To show that totally diffusing stereotypes of the African continent and African nations, but embellishing on the fact that back in, what did we say, 760 BC, there were benevolent leaders. They weren't just warriors that were running around slaughtering, maiming, raping, and pillaging, but people that were actually ruling over sophisticated societies.
The mixability of these two cultures, which is fundamental to the fact that the 25th dynasty arrived on the scene, is something that needs to be pursued more both in Egyptian studies and in Nubian studies.
So I think that there are times when the Lord allows a certain level of perfection and a certain level of peak performance to write its signature on history. that season can be rewind as a memorial in time, that's what it was supposed to do at that season. That's there as a part of the archives.
Currently, the Sudanese government has, with the assistance of the Germans, the French, and the Chinese, have built a huge dam about 350 miles northwest of Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan. Now, the Sudan is the region in which the artifacts and the holy cities and the temples of the 25th Dynasty's empire are largely located. Now, the significance of this project, it's known as the Miro Dam, is that it is going to flood out an entire area that encompasses the sites and most of the locations of these artifacts. We are aware that the Poles, the Italians, and a group of archaeologists from the University of Chicago here in the U.S. were feverishly working on a salvage dig to basically get as many of the artifacts that they could salvage before the dam became operational. It's our understanding that the operation commenced somewhere in late September or early October of 2008. So this area has now been flooded. There are other remnants of Nubian's empire and Nubian civilization that are down or south of this particular dam, and it is our understanding that the Sudanese government is planning another large irrigation project, very similar to the Miro project, in this area, which is around the third cataract of the Nile River. So the importance here is the fact that this is history. This is a base of knowledge of this civilization that's lost forever.
I call upon the French. I call upon the Chinese who have perhaps the longest continuous history of any group of people in the world, that they do more to accelerate the digs and the recovery of information about these people.
But maybe there's a lesson in this, and the lesson is, rather than wait until someone's about to build a dam, we have to pay a great deal more attention to history without all the biases that makes it so difficult for us to simply study Africa.
There was almost no exploration there before the dam was begun. And there was a very intense period of a decade or so where people were working to try and rescue archaeology there. It's not a compensation that the archaeology is now all gone, that we have a great deal to work with right now that we would not have. Of course, a lot was lost, and the ability to go back and check your results is not there. So it does have that negative side to it.
What if young African Americans in the hood, what if they really knew that there were people that maybe had the same kind of skin color that they had, maybe had some kind of historical connection to where they came from, and that these people had developed an extraordinary language. These people developed an art and a form of mathematics, and that what they developed preceded what we in America consider to be what happened when our country was founded. To know that there are people to whom they may have a connection that developed things thousands of years ago that was perhaps equal and superior at the time, put it in historical, than what we have now. So that's very empowering.
Yeah, so one of the exciting things about Nubian archaeology is that, unlike many parts of the world, even to some extent Egypt, we can really change history by what we find, because so little has been known in the recent past about it.
The history that locks so many stories and historical events relating to the Kushites out of our canon, out of the body of knowledge, what it is really doing is reinforcing the attempt to create a slave mentality that began with the transatlantic slave trade. And of course, people today would be horrified if they were in any way associated with trying to do any such thing, but it's not the bad intentions of contemporary society. It's the fact that contemporary society has not dismantled a worldview that was put together with a particular hidden agenda. And the agenda was not so hidden. The agenda was to to rationalize slavery by saying, we are civilizing these people. They do not have a history. This issue of the Cushites is not relevant. It's all just minor, minimal, marginal stuff in order to reinforce a false notion that a particular group, Europeans, had a well-substantiated history and Africans did not. I mean, it just so happens that all human beings have a history, and that's all there is to it.